Thank you very much, Dasan. And let me say it's a great pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon. On the theme for my remarks, what I'm proposing to do is to have two kind of themes that I want to expand upon. One is the repeating bouts of macroeconomic stress that we've had, which has resulted in Sri Lanka having 17 IMF programs. And secondly, also to make the case for developing a new growth strategy, a new growth model, which gives us sustained growth based on export transformation. So those are the two kind of themes I'd like to expand upon. But by way of introduction, I don't need to tell all of you, you know better than I do, that we've had extremely impressive stabilization of the economy from where we were 3 years ago. The Sri Lankan economy has performed better than anybody expected. But we've been here before, in the sense that even in the earlier IMF programs, 17, I think we completed about a dozen. We did the stabilization part, okay. Otherwise, we wouldn't have completed the program. But somehow we don't get the structural reforms done. And then, when elections come, governments try to take shortcuts. And they try to boost growth through unsustainable macroeconomic policies, trying to get a sugar high for the election. And then after the election, again, the economy, the imbalances become too great, and we have elevated inflation, you have pressure on the exchange rate, and we have to go back to an IMF program. So, have we broken that repeating cycle? And I'm going to try to make the case that we have. If we are to have sustained prosperity in the country, I think you have to create a stable foundation. And a stable foundation is strong macroeconomic fundamentals, which we have not been able to achieve on a sustained basis. Okay, what is different this time? So I am saying that we've stabilized before, but then that could not be sustained. What is different this time? So if you recall, the root cause of our macro instability has invariably been the government's budgetary operation. From time to time, there have been exogenous shocks also, which have caused imbalances in the economy, but most of the time, it's missteps, domestic policy missteps, starting with the budget. Particularly, as I said, as elections approach, the budgetary discipline slips, and the deficits are enlarged, and that creates excess aggregate demand in the system. So, consequently, you have elevated inflation, and some of the excess demands translates into demand for imports, which also puts pressure on the balance of payments. And then, when the FX situation becomes completely unsustainable, we go to the IMF. So that's been a repeating cycle. Several rounds of this have taken place under all governments. So what has been done to break that cycle? And here I want to make the case that we now have a new paradigm for macroeconomic policy making. And that new paradigm has two pillars. One is the Public Finance Management Act, and the other is the Central Bank Act. So taking the Public Finance Management Act, you have, in the past, under the old Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, also we had a fiscal rule. The rule, I think, was 70% of GDP for government debt. But when it was set in 2002, when the act was passed in 2002, the target was set about 10 years further down the line. Subsequently, each time the deadline came, Parliament just postponed the deadline. And so the fiscal rule was utterly ineffective. But now, under the Public Finance Management Act, the rules have to be met every year. So you have to have a primary surplus of 2.3% every year. You have to have revenue of 15% of GDP and a primary expenditure target of 13% of GDP. So the rules are much, much tighter. And of course, if you deviate from those rules, you are actually breaking the law. So having a clear framework for fiscal policy and embedding it in the law is something entirely new. Then, what used to happen, in addition to the kind of unsustainable budget deficits, on the central bank side, there was fiscal forbearance in monetary policy. And there were two channels through which this fiscal forbearance was materialized. One is deficit financing, and the most egregious form was the central bank's participation in primary auctions. That was basically just creating hot money. And the second, and of course temporary overdrafts. There are various ways in which the central bank lent money to the government. Now, under the new Central Bank Act, by law, the central bank cannot fund the government. So the government has to stand on its own 2 feet. So that form of money creation is no longer possible. Equally, there was also the second channel for fiscal forbearance was financial repression. The central bank could artificially manipulate the interest rate structure and bring it down. One, to create cheap money for the government, and two, to try to create a sugar high in growth, unsustainable sugar high in growth, invariably before an election. So that both these things are no longer possible. The Central Bank Act prevents deficit financing of any sort to the government, temporary overdrafts, primary auctions, nothing. And also, as far as financial repression is concerned, the interest rates are now set through a flexible inflation targeting regime. So the finance minister sets the inflation target in consultation with the governor, and then it becomes a data-dependent, forward-looking regime driven primarily by inflation expectations. And so it's data-driven. The central bank has improved its modeling and forecasting capability, etc. So there is no scope for artificially setting the interest rates in an administrative way. You have to set it through this flexible inflation targeting framework. So that when the fiscal forbearance was there, in addition to excess demand being created by large fiscal deficits, these monetary operations of the central bank, or the monetary policy operations of the central bank, also created excess aggregate demand. So you had everything coming together to push up inflation and to put pressure on the balance of payments. So now, because the budget fiscal rules have been tightened, there's a clear framework for monetary policy formulation, which prevents the earlier forms of fiscal forbearance in monetary policy. All this means that the chances of having this kind of excess aggregate demand being created through fiscal and monetary policy is now greatly reduced. In fact, if you stick to the law, then it's unlikely you will get this repeating macroeconomic stress. And what does that mean in practical terms? It means that interest rates should be more stable and lower, generally, and the exchange rate should be more stable. It will be more volatile on a day-to-day basis, because under the flexible inflation targeting regime, the exchange rate is the first line of defense for any kind of pressure on the external side. So the exchange rate has to be managed flexibly and based on the supply and demand dynamics in the FX market. Now, our market is only 60 million, so you will get movements up and down. And on a day-to-day basis, you could see the exchange rate moving around. So earlier we used to try to fix the rate, but now what you will see in practice is more movement of the exchange rate than in the past, but it will be within a much narrower range. You're not going to have this kind of, the playbook in the past, but when the exchange rate came under pressure, we basically tried to defend the indefensible by depleting our foreign exchange reserves. So eventually there was always a double whammy. So you find that at the end you have to depreciate the currency pretty sharply, and at the same time you've lost your reserves as well, part of your reserves as well. So that kind of double whammy now should be not possible. So in terms of preserving the people's wealth, you will have, I think, a more stable exchange rate within a band, and not an artificially created band, but in terms of market dynamics, the exchange rate should move within a fairly narrow band, but moving up and down, reflecting the day-to-day supply and demand dynamics of the exchange rate. So if you take all this together, I think we have cracked the problem in terms of repeated bouts of macroeconomic stress. Now, from business point of view, managing on a day-to-day basis can be a little bit more difficult than in the past because there will be these movements on a day-to-day basis, but you won't get this dramatic depreciation of the currency or sudden elevation of interest rates. So in that sense, it's a much more stable environment for business and a more predictable environment to do business in. So that's all very positive. But what this has done, in my view, is created a good, stable foundation. But while a foundation is critical, you have to build a house as well, right? And there we barely scratch the surface. Question is, have we done the structural reforms to make sure that we have this new growth model, which is based on export transformation? Now, way back in 1978, J.R. Jayawardena said, export or perish. Now, we have had periods where we have done some reforms, but they've invariably been partial and often they have been reversed. So from 2000 onwards, if you look, we have actually fast forwarded in the wrong direction. In 2000, exports of goods and services as a percent of GDP was roughly about 35%. Today, it's about half that, right? Despite saying export or perish, we're actually half where we were in 2000. Equally, in terms of the openness of the economy, that's exports plus imports as a percent of GDP. In 2000, it was about 75%. Now it is closer to 35, again half. And in terms of the benefits of openness, you only have to look at China. The coastal regions of China, which are integrated with the global economy, more integrated with the global economy, they've prospered far, far more than the hinterland, which is far more closed. That in itself shows you the benefits of openness. Now, of course, the world economy has changed and is continuing to change, etc. It's a different global landscape. But that basic point that openness has given dynamism to economies is a valid one even today. And particularly if your market is only 23 million people, based on a purchasing power of 4,000 USD per capita. So, we have gone completely in the wrong direction over the last 25 years. I mean, there were periods where things have changed a bit or not, but the overall thrust has been entirely in the wrong direction. So we need to create, first is to address the anti-export bias in our basic policy framework. For instance, the level of protection is channeling resources into the non-tradable sector. And the exchange rate has often been overvalued, which means that we are actually subsidizing foreign producers at the expense of domestic producers. And we have excluded ourselves from the most dynamic component of the international trading system, which is these global supply chains. Because once you put a para-tariff like PAL or CES in the middle, you become uncompetitive, because the system of global production networks is that the material comes in, you do your little bit and you put it out. But if you stick a para-tariff in the middle like CES or PAL, because the margins are so fine, you exclude yourself. So as a result, intermediate export, that is basically material coming in, the country doing its bit and sending it out, is less than 5%. In Malaysia, Thailand, I believe it's more than 50%. So we've, as I said, cut ourselves away from the most dynamic component of the international trading system, which is cross-border supply chain. So those things we need to put right. And also we need to do basic reforms in terms of improving the competitiveness of the economy. Way back in the 1980s, I was seconded from the central bank to the finance ministry and became the bag carrier for the finance minister at the time, the late Mr. Ronald Reagan. So I used to wander around with him and listen to his speeches. And what he said about structural reform is exactly what we are saying today. So reform factor markets, reform SOEs, improve the investment climate, improve investment promotion, strengthen trade policy including trade agreements, strengthen trade facilitation, education, training and skills development. The agenda has not changed. You know, we've done a little bit here and there, but as we've seen from what the trends in exports and in the openness of the economy, we've done remarkably little. Then you have to ask the question, I mean, you know, people in this country are smart enough, why is it that we haven't been able to do this? Because lots of other countries have managed it, particularly in Asia, lots of countries have been able to create a growth model based on export transformation. And most of the time it's been driven by FDI. You don't see export transformation without FDI, the capital, the markets, the know-how it brings. So why is it that we couldn't get this done? And I can only think of two reasons. One is the gestation period for payoff from structural reform is relatively long, and it is often more than one political cycle. So there is no incentive for politicians to get these done. The second and most probably significant response is, while these reforms have many winners, they also result in some very, very powerful losers. Few of them in number, but they are very powerful because they have a strong vested interest in the status quo. So clearly, you know, they resist. And it could be businesses, it could be trade unions. So that people have been very successful in resisting structural reform. So why is it so important that we have now really a laser-like focus on structural reform? There are two reasons. One is, as you know, poverty has increased dramatically. Within 2 years, the income poverty doubled. The Sri Lankans have been, and I think as far as multidimensional poverty is concerned, I think over 50%. And a UNDP study found about 55% of the people are multidimensionally vulnerable. So, I mean, the Sri Lankan people have been extraordinarily patient so far, but whether they will be patient, how long they will be patient, unless they see some material improvement in their living standards, is clearly a question mark. And at some point, they're going to lose patience, and there will be the prospect of political and social unrest. So you need growth quickly for that. The other reason is, in 2028, we need to be able to A, repay our debt obligations, because right now we're not paying the capital on the commercial debt. So we've serviced multilateral debt throughout, and now we've started to pay interest on bilateral debt and on the ISBs. But from 2028, we'll have to make the capital repayments as well. We'll have to meet the higher debt servicing and finance all our imports. So that's a crunch time. And in all, the central bank reckons, to make sure that we are sustainable in terms of debt, we need to have a 5% plus growth. So that's a challenge. Now, the last few quarters we've been getting 5% growth. So one could think, you know, we're getting this anyway, what is the big deal? But that 5% growth in last few quarters is based on two transitory factors. One is, you know, the economy went from peak to trough. There was a 10% decline in GDP. And the economy went from contraction to expansion, I think, in the third quarter of 2023. So for the 4 subsequent quarters, we had a very strong base effect. And that helped to get the kind of 5% growth we got in 2 or 3 of those quarters. Then subsequently, there has been considerable underutilization of capacity, partly because of import controls, lack of confidence, lack of demand, etc., domestic demand, etc. So you have this spare capacity that was there, but with the debt restructuring being completed, with the IMF program progressing, with the rating being upgraded, now you're beginning to see private sector credit flow and capacity utilization increasing. So that again gives a boost to growth without the need for additional investment. But once the level of GDP comes back to where it was before the crisis, i.e. once you make up the 10% contraction, then you will need new capacity, new investment. So we will probably be able to catch up by the end of this year. We got 5% growth last year, 4.5 or so this year, so it's 9.5, we are almost up to 10. And once the level of GDP has been regained, then you will need new capacity and new investment. It becomes much more difficult to sustain the 5% growth. So that's the critical thing now. So if we are to kind of create a wealthy country and prosperous country, etc., we have to continue with the new macroeconomic policy making paradigm, and we need to get the structural reforms done to have 5% plus.